The morning Elizabeth Hartwell found the baby, the air was so cold it turned her breath to fog. She'd risen before dawn as she always did, alone in the small ranch house her father had built 30 years ago when Wyoming was still wild and full of promise. The cattle needed tending, the chickens needed feeding, and the fence on the eastern pasture needed mending before the next storm rolled through. At 41 years old, Elizabeth had learned that survival on the frontier meant starting each day before the sun and ending it long after dark. She opened the front door expecting nothing more than the familiar sight of her porch and the empty road beyond. Instead, she found a basket covered with a worn quilt, and from within that basket came the unmistakable sound of an infant crying. Elizabeth froze, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. She looked left and right down the road, but there was no one. No wagon tracks in the frost. No sign of whoever had left this burden on her doorstep. She knelt beside the basket and pulled back the quilt. The baby was tiny, perhaps 2 or 3 months old, wrapped in layers of blankets that were clean but threadbare. The child's face was red from crying, small fists waving in distress. Elizabeth's hands shook as she reached for the baby, her heart pounding with a mixture of shock and something else she couldn't quite name. Tucked beside the infant was an envelope, her name written on it in an unfamiliar hand. Elizabeth lifted the baby carefully, cradling the small body against her chest. The crying stopped almost immediately, and 2 gray eyes looked up at her with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. She carried the basket inside, set it on the kitchen table, and with one hand still holding the baby, she opened the envelope. The note inside was written on a single page, the letters formed carefully but with obvious effort. It read, "Miss Hartwell, I am dying and have no time left. This is my daughter Grace. Her father was your brother Thomas. He never knew about her because I never told him before he was killed at Gettysburg. I have no family left and no way to care for her. You are her only blood. I beg you to take her and give her the life I cannot. Her father spoke of you with love and said you were the strongest person he knew. Please forgive me for this burden. Her mother, Catherine Wells." Elizabeth read the note 3 times, each word hitting her like a physical blow. Thomas. Her brother who died in the war 17 years ago, who'd been barely 21 when he marched off to fight and never came home. She'd mourned him with her parents, watched her mother die of grief 2 years later and her father follow 5 years after that. Thomas had been her only sibling, her childhood companion, and losing him had carved a hole in her life that never quite healed. And now this baby, this impossibly small person with Thomas's gray eyes, was staring up at her like she held all the answers. Elizabeth sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, and Elizabeth looked down at her. Grace, her niece, Thomas's daughter. The revelation was staggering, reshaping everything she thought she knew about her brother's short life. The practical part of Elizabeth's mind, the part that had kept her alive and functioning through years of solitude and hard work, began to catalog the problems this presented. She had no experience with babies. Her ranch was barely profitable enough to support 1 person, let alone 2. She was unmarried and past the age where anyone expected her to be, and a single woman raising an infant would attract gossip and judgment from the already skeptical community of Sweetwater Creek. But beneath all those practical concerns was something deeper, something that had awakened the moment she'd pulled back that quilt. This child was family, the last piece of Thomas she would ever have. And the note said she was the strongest person Thomas had known. Elizabeth had spent 17 years proving that strength to herself and everyone around her. But she'd done it alone, had chosen solitude because it was easier than risking the kind of pain that came from loving and losing. Grace began to cry again, a hungry, desperate sound. Elizabeth realized with a start that the baby needed to eat, needed warmth, needed care immediately. She had no milk, no bottles, no supplies whatsoever for an infant. The nearest neighbor was Martha Chen, a widow who lived 2 miles down the road and had raised 6 children of her own. Elizabeth wrapped Grace in one of her own shawls, saddled her horse with fumbling fingers, and rode through the cold morning with the baby clutched against her chest. Martha took one look at Elizabeth standing on her porch, wild-eyed and holding an infant, and pulled her inside without questions. She sat Elizabeth down, took the baby with practiced ease, and disappeared into her kitchen. She returned with a bottle of goat's milk warmed to exactly the right temperature, and began feeding Grace while Elizabeth explained in a tumbling rush of words what had happened. Martha listened, her weathered face showing no surprise, only compassion and the practical assessment of a woman who'd seen every kind of hardship the frontier could offer. When Elizabeth finished, Martha simply nodded and said the baby would need more than goat's milk, that there were supplies required and arrangements to be made. She made a list in her careful handwriting while Grace finished the bottle and fell asleep in her arms. Martha said she'd spread the word that Elizabeth's niece had come to live with her, that the mother had died, and that anyone who wanted to gossip about it could answer to her first. The firmness in her voice made Elizabeth want to weep with gratitude. They spent the morning gathering supplies from Martha's own stores, things her youngest children had outgrown but never thrown away. Bottles and blankets, tiny clothes and cloth diapers, a cradle that Martha's husband had built before his death. Martha showed Elizabeth how to mix the milk, how to test the temperature, how to hold the baby and burp her and change her. The lessons were swift and practical, delivered with the understanding that Elizabeth would need to learn by doing. By afternoon, Elizabeth returned home with Grace sleeping in the makeshift carrier Martha had fashioned, and enough supplies to last a few weeks. The ranch looked different somehow, as if the simple act of bringing a child into it had changed its fundamental nature. Elizabeth set up the cradle in her bedroom, laid Grace down gently, and then stood watching the baby sleep for a long time, trying to adjust to the seismic shift her life had just taken. The first weeks were harder than anything Elizabeth had ever experienced. She'd survived brutal winters, droughts that killed half her herd, and the bone-deep loneliness of running a ranch alone, but nothing prepared her for the relentless demands of an infant. Grace needed feeding every few hours, day and night. She cried for reasons Elizabeth couldn't decipher, slept in unpredictable bursts, and required constant vigilance. The ranch work suffered. Fences went unmended, cattle wandered, and Elizabeth functioned in a fog of exhaustion. But something was happening beneath the exhaustion, something Elizabeth hadn't expected. Every time she picked up Grace, every time those gray eyes focused on her face, every small smile or contented sound the baby made, Elizabeth felt something inside her thawing. She'd spent 17 years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that independence and solitude were strengths, rather than just different forms of surrender. Grace was demolishing those walls without effort, simply by existing, by needing her, by being the living legacy of the brother she'd loved and lost. The town of Sweetwater Creek had its opinions, of course. Some folks accepted Martha's explanation without question, grateful for the simple story that didn't require uncomfortable speculation. Others whispered behind their hands, creating elaborate scenarios about Elizabeth's secret past or moral failings. Elizabeth discovered she didn't care as much as she thought she would. Let them talk. She had more important things to worry about than the judgment of people who'd never had the courage to live as she had. Winter deepened, and Elizabeth adapted. She learned to work with Grace strapped to her chest, the baby bundled against the cold while Elizabeth fed cattle and broke ice in the water troughs. She learned to function on interrupted sleep, to read Grace's different cries, to find moments of joy in the small miracles of watching an infant discover the world. Martha visited weekly, bringing supplies and advice, and other women from town began to come too, drawn by the universal language of motherhood and the desire to help one of their own. Spring came slowly, as it always did in Wyoming. The snow retreated, the ground thawed, and Grace grew bigger and more alert. Elizabeth found herself talking to the baby constantly, narrating her work, telling stories about Thomas, about their childhood on this ranch, about the mother and father Grace would never know. She wasn't sure how much a 6-month-old could understand, but it felt important to speak these things aloud, to keep the memories alive. One afternoon in April, Elizabeth was working in the barn with Grace asleep in a basket nearby when she heard a horse approaching. She stepped outside to find a woman dismounting, someone she didn't recognize. The stranger was perhaps 35, dressed in travel-worn clothes, and her face was gaunt with illness. Elizabeth felt her heart sink, knowing somehow what this visitor meant even before the woman spoke. The woman introduced herself as Catherine Wells, and Elizabeth's breath caught. The note had said she was dying, but Elizabeth had assumed that meant she was already gone, that Grace was truly alone. Catherine explained that she'd lived longer than the doctor expected, had spent the last months in a charity hospital in Denver, fighting the consumption that was slowly drowning her lungs. She'd saved every penny from her work as a seamstress to make this one last journey, to see for herself that her daughter was safe and cared for. Elizabeth invited her inside, her emotions a tangle of resentment and pity and fear. Catherine stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Grace sleep in her basket, and tears streamed down her face. She whispered that the baby looked healthy, looked loved, and that she'd been so afraid Elizabeth would turn her away or give her to an orphanage. Elizabeth found her voice and said she would never do that Grace was family, that she was staying right here where she belonged. Catherine nodded and seemed to collapse inward with relief. Elizabeth made tea and they sat at the kitchen table while Catherine told her story. She'd met Thomas in the last weeks before his regiment shipped out, had fallen in love with the kind young man who talked about his sister's ranch and the life he hoped to return to. They'd spent 3 days together before he left, and Catherine had discovered she was pregnant 2 months later. By the time she worked up the courage to write to him, the letter came back marked deceased. She'd raised Grace alone for 2 months, working when she could, but the consumption had come on fast and vicious. She'd known she was dying, had known she had no family who could take the baby, and had remembered Thomas's stories about his capable, strong sister in Wyoming. It had been a desperate gamble, leaving Grace on Elizabeth's porch, but Catherine had no other options. She'd walked to the nearest town after making the delivery, used her last money for medicine that didn't work, and had been preparing to die when her condition temporarily stabilized. Elizabeth listened to this story with a growing understanding of how much courage it must have taken for Catherine to give up her child. She asked Catherine how long the doctors gave her, and Catherine said weeks at most, perhaps days. She said she hadn't come to take Grace back, just to see her one last time and to thank Elizabeth for the mercy she'd shown. Elizabeth made a decision then, one that surprised her even as she spoke the words. She invited Catherine to stay for however long she had left, so she could be with her daughter. Catherine stared at her in disbelief, and Elizabeth explained that no mother should have to die alone, separated from her child. The ranch had a spare room, small and plain, but it was warm and dry. Catherine could rest there, could hold Grace and tell her stories, could have these last precious weeks or days as she deserved. Catherine broke down completely then, sobbing with gratitude and relief. And Elizabeth held this stranger who'd loved her brother, understanding that sometimes family was more than blood. The weeks that followed were bittersweet. Catherine grew weaker daily, but she spent every moment she could with Grace, holding her, singing to her, pouring 17 years of unlived motherhood into those fleeting hours. Elizabeth watched and learned things about Thomas she'd never known, saw him through Catherine's eyes as a gentle, funny young man full of dreams and kindness. She and Catherine became something like friends, bound by their shared love for the same people and their determination to give Grace the best life possible. Catherine died on a Tuesday morning in early May, with Elizabeth holding one hand and baby Grace sleeping in the cradle beside the bed. Her last words were "thank you," whispered so softly Elizabeth almost missed them. They buried her in the small plot behind the ranch house where Elizabeth's parents rested, and Elizabeth marked the grave with a simple wooden cross bearing Catherine's name and the inscription "Beloved Mother." Summer came, and with it a new rhythm to Elizabeth's life. Grace was crawling now, exploring the world with fearless determination. Elizabeth found herself smiling more than she had in years, found joy in the simple pleasure of watching a child grow and discover. The ranch prospered too, as if the presence of new life had breathed vitality into the land itself. The cattle were healthy, the crops grew well, and Elizabeth managed the work with a new efficiency born of necessity. The town had fully accepted Grace by then, the story of her origins transformed by time and repetition into something almost romantic. The women who'd initially gossiped became regular visitors, bringing gifts for the baby and staying for coffee and conversation. Elizabeth discovered she'd built a community without quite meaning to, that opening her heart to one small person had somehow opened it to everyone else as well. On Grace's first birthday, Elizabeth held a small celebration. Martha came, along with a dozen other women from town and their children. They ate cake and watched Grace demolish her own small piece with enthusiastic messiness. Elizabeth looked around her kitchen, crowded with people and noise and life, and realized this was what Thomas had dreamed of when he talked about coming home. This was what their parents had hoped for when they built this ranch. A place where family could grow and thrive and put down roots. That evening, after everyone had gone and Grace was asleep, Elizabeth sat on her porch watching the sunset. She thought about the note that had changed everything, about Catherine's desperate gamble and her own terrified decision to accept the responsibility thrust upon her. She thought about how close she'd come to refusing, to turning away from the burden and the risk and the vulnerability that came with loving someone so completely. She'd believed for so long that strength meant standing alone, that independence was the highest virtue, that protecting herself from loss meant avoiding love. But Grace had taught her differently. Real strength was in choosing to love despite the certainty of pain, in opening yourself to another person's needs, in building something that would outlast you. Grace had given her back her brother in a way, had filled the house with laughter and chaos and purpose. But more than that, she'd given Elizabeth back herself, the part that had shut down when Thomas died, the part that believed in possibility and future and hope. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Elizabeth made a silent promise to Thomas, to Catherine, and to Grace. She would raise this child with love and wisdom, would teach her to be strong but not hardened, capable but not closed off, independent but not alone. She would tell her stories about her father and mother, would make sure she knew she came from love even if that love was brief, and she would give her the one thing Elizabeth herself had almost lost along the way, the courage to let people in, to build connections, to create family from whatever materials life provided. Inside the house, Grace stirred and made a small sound. Elizabeth rose and went to her, lifting the baby from her cradle and holding her close. Grace settled immediately, her small hand gripping Elizabeth's finger with absolute trust. Elizabeth carried her to the window and showed her the stars beginning to fill the sky, whispering about the beauty of the world and all the adventures waiting for her. In that moment, standing in the home that had been built by hope and sustained by determination, Elizabeth understood that she'd been given an extraordinary gift. Not just a child to raise, but a second chance at the kind of life she'd thought was lost forever. A life filled with love, with family, with the magnificent risk of caring about someone more than yourself. She'd found a baby on her porch one frozen morning, along with a note that changed everything. But what she'd really found was her way back to being fully human, fully alive, fully open to whatever joy and sorrow the future might hold. And for that, she would be grateful every remaining day of her life.